My granddad's been going through a lot lately. After Grandma died, he kinda went a little mushy. We were asked to come and get him one night after he was found wandering near his house, the police suggesting that we might want to have someone keep an eye on him. Since I was just sitting around the house and doing nothing with my life, my parents extended the idea that this might give me a little freedom since I had recently been chafing under my father's rules. They gave me rules, of course, like no using my grandfather's house for wild parties, no sneaking girls in at all hours of the night, and my grandfather's safety would come first. If we get another call about him wandering off, he will be moving to the nursing home, and you will be moving back home. So, I moved my things in with Grandpa, and we became roommates. Grandpa was a pretty good roommate, all things considered. I lived upstairs in the loft. Grandpa had a loft-style house with a whole other dwelling upstairs. And he lived downstairs since it was hard for him to get up and down the stairs sometimes. I did most of the cooking and cleaning. Grandpa bought the groceries and the beer, though that was our little secret, and we lived in harmony most days. The only thing that kind of annoyed me were the stories. Don't get me wrong, Grandpa has a lot of good stories. He's been in the Gulf War, he'd driven trucks in Alaska on treacherous roads, he'd spent almost all his life in the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, this house had been his childhood home. He had many stories about camping and exploring and roaming the woods around the property, those I didn't mind hearing so much. There were many nights that Granddad and I would sit on the porch with a case of beer, and he would tell me stories about exploring the woods and discovering its majesty. It was the lies he would tell sometimes that really got to me. He made up some pretty outlandish claims about the woods that I just couldn't shake off. He would claim to have met a Sasquatch, running for his life as it chased him from the part of the woods it lived in. He had met forest spirits and spent a month in their camp as time moved differently there. He had met animal people, spoken with pale, moonlight guardians that lived underground, and many other things. It wasn't just drunken tales either. Those I could have forgiven, but he would ambush me sometimes with these strange little stories. You'd be washing dishes or cleaning the living room or brushing your teeth, and suddenly he'd just be behind you with a tall tale. I mostly rolled my eyes at these stories, but last night he told me something just truly ridiculous. My best friend Wren turned into a tree. I had choked a little on my beer and finally set it down. I was a little drunk, and maybe I shouldn't have let it frustrate me, but these stories were becoming a bit much. I'd heard all manner of stories from Grandpa and just sort of shrugged them off or politely listened to them, but this one was so bizarre that it took me by surprise. His friend had turned into a tree? What the hell did that mean? Your friend turned into a tree, I challenged. Grandpa nodded and took a swig of his own beer. How, Grandpa? Tell me how a person turns into a tree. He looked thoughtful. It's kind of a long story. Are you sure you have time for it? I was off the next couple of days, so I guessed I did. Yeah, I would say I have time for it. Grandpa finished his beer and threw the bottle into the woods, and I heard it break against a nearby tree. This was a habit he had kept from my childhood, and no one seemed to be able to break him of it. The funny thing was that despite him smashing the bottles, I never found any glass in the woods around his house. I always assumed that Grandma had cleaned it up, but it had continued after Grandma was gone. Just one of life's little mysteries, I told myself. And so, Grandpa began his odd tale. When I was about 9, a new boy moved into the valley. His name was Renoir, but I always just called him Ren. His family was from the Bayou, Louisiana, and he was unsure how things worked out in the Appalachians. Still, I was glad for a new playmate since our closest neighbor was 5 miles in either direction, and we played in the hills and forests around our home. Ren liked to find bugs and small spiders and put them in jars so he could study them. Ren fancied himself something of a scientist, and the Appalachian forests offered him much to explore. Now, the woods were always open to me. Mama never told us we couldn't explore, but Grandma had warned me never to go into the southern grove without her. It was beautiful there, The forest's old and different somehow from the rest of the sprawling valley. I would ask her why I couldn't explore there alone, and she would say that it was dangerous if you didn't know what not to touch and what to leave well enough alone. Like this, she'd say, pointing to a thick, almost honey-like sap that was oozing from a nearby tree. This is the sap of the old calabash tree. You never ever touch it, for if you do, not even I can help you. I asked her why, and she said that her grandma had told her the same many years ago, and she was now telling it to me. It's just one of those rules that we follow, one of those rules we don't question. I had always listened, but Ren was inquisitive. He wanted to explore everything, and he noticed that we were avoiding that particular stretch of forest. I had told him those stories about the places that we weren't allowed to go when we first met. I told him there were two-headed beetles that lived there. There were strange flowers in technicolor patterns, and the large trees that my grandma had always called calabash. He asked me to take him there, not really feeling comfortable exploring the woods alone yet. He was never far from my side when we were in the woods, and he asked me specifically one afternoon if we could go out there. We were young, 10 at the most, and it didn't take much to convince me. I had tried to remain steadfast, not wanting anything to happen since I never went there without Grandma. But he finally broke me down, and I agreed to take him. But I said that he had to do what I say. Don't touch nothing, I told him, especially if I say so. He promised that he wouldn't, and we set off for the grove. We stopped at his house before we went, and he came back with a backpack that clinked a little as he walked. I had little doubt that it was full of specimen jars and other such things. He may not have intended to touch, but he definitely intended to study. So we made our way to the grove, and as soon as he saw that oddly colored place, he was in love. The grove is a special place, you see. Things there are closer to nature than anywhere else, and Grandma always said it was easy to feel the old world magic that connected the people to the earth, and the people who spend a lot of time there can sometimes hear the voice of the forest that others have forgotten. When Grandma read Robert Frost, she thought that maybe he had found some sort of grove of his own. We spent an hour just exploring the grove. Ren looked at the beetles, putting one into a jar so he could study it later, and sketched some of the plants that he made notes on. I showed him the calabash tree, that massive white gold giant, and I saw the wonder in his eyes that was there every time he found a bug or a leaf he didn't recognize. He approached it, and I understood his need to touch it. I myself had needed to touch it the first time to make really sure I understood what I was seeing. It's the size of it, I think. Your mind tells you that nothing that big can possibly be real, but once you touch it, you just know that it must exist. It wasn't until I saw him take his knife out that I realized what his true intentions were. I ran forward, telling him not to, but he seemed mesmerized by that golden bark of that towering tree. He wanted some. That much was obvious, but Grandma had always made it very clear that you do not strip the bark from the calabash tree. Ren didn't know. He probably assumed that a tree so large would have plenty of bark. He couldn't have known what lay beneath. As his knife slid easily into the soft bark of the calabash tree, a golden spurt of sap struck him full in the face. He stumbled back, the sap flowing as his knife quivered in the side of that massive trunk, and I saw him clutch his face and scream. I pulled him away from the tree. The roots threatened to trip him, and as his hands came down, I could see that his face was changing. His face was turning brown, his skin thickening, and the pigment of his eyes was beginning to film over as though he was blind. "What's happening?" Wren asked, his voice deepening as his throat stiffened. I didn't know, but I knew what I had to do. I left his bag on the ground, the jars slamming together angrily, and pulled him onto my shoulders. We were both 3 miles out into the woods, but Wren wasn't very heavy. He was small, even for a boy of 10, and I pulled him onto my back and carried him with very little effort. We ran, heading for my grandmother's house. Grandma would know what to do. She would fix him. As I ran, I just knew that if I could get him there, she could save him. We hadn't gone far when he started getting heavy. Like I said, he wasn't large, but I was only 10, and Wren was starting to get really heavy. The boy was light when we left the grove, me walking as I bounced him on my back, but he became heavier and heavier as we walked. His arms hung uselessly at my sides, and his body became like a stone in the center of my back. His legs started to shake as my progress was slowed to a crawl. When I was drawing up short, I thought maybe one of his feet caught on something. I looked back and almost dropped him. His feet had elongated until they dug up behind me, his toes becoming long and searching. They were pushing their way down into the ground, and as I pulled, they attempted to root themselves in the dirt. I pulled him along, trying my best to get him to my grandmother's, but eventually I just couldn't take him any further. We were in a clearing, a stream trickling through that I knew would be a heavy little crossing with the winter flow, and I left him there, saying I would go get help. Wren called me back, though, and asked me to stay with him. I told him that I couldn't do that. If I gave up, he'd be stuck like this. My grandma knew about these sorts of things, and she might be able to help him. I made all kinds of excuses, but in the end, I was just scared. This was so weird, so odd, and my 10-year-old brain didn't know what to do about it. He said, "Please," and asked me to stay, his voice cracking like a branch in a high wind. And after some hesitation, I sat and said that I would. His arms and legs were stiff and bark-like, and he cried tears of yellow sap. I wanted to reach out and wipe them away, but I remembered what that sap had done to him and resisted. His feet were growing, breaking the ground and sliding into the earth as they sought purchase. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said it was very strange. He said that as he grew, everything seemed to slow down, to lighten, and he was filled with an odd sense of eternity. He said he felt ancient and brand new. He felt lonely, yet filled with the knowledge that he was never alone. He felt sad for the life he was leaving behind, but excited for the life that was beginning. The process took about 20 minutes from start to finish, and I sat with him as he changed, not wanting him to go through it alone. His skin thickened, taking on a wooden cast as his legs descended into the earth. His chest expanded, Wren groaning as his bones and his body grew, and his small arms were thrust upward as he reached for the sky. His face and body sort of grew into one, becoming his trunk, and his eyes began to sink into his newly formed trunk body. Much too soon, he was a tree, and I was left sitting beside a half-grown sapling with a pair of expressive rings in its trunk. I was left looking into those way too expressive eyes as he sat looking out onto the forest, never to move again. I sat there, mouth agape, as Grandpa finished his story. What happened after that? Surely no one believed that he had turned into a tree. Grandpa shook his head. Only one person. My family and his spent the night searching the woods with a search party from the town. They thought that something had happened to him, and my brain had made up something to cope with it. They could see I was shaken by whatever had happened, and they still wanted to find Wren to make sure he was okay. I tried to tell them, tried to explain what had happened, but my grandma appeared at that moment and wrapped an arm around me. She told them she would watch me while the town searched, and took me into her house for a cocoa. Over cocoa and cookies, she told me that she had tried to warn me about the grove. She said it was a tragedy what had happened, but that was the way of the world sometimes. He took a last pull off his beer and launched it into the woods. She said that life was cruel sometimes, but that there was an order. Wren had tried to go outside that order. He had broke the rules, and that cruelty took its revenge. She reminded me that I must never go against that order, not if I wanted to live amongst nature. I thought about this before shaking my head and telling him I didn't believe it. People don't just turn into trees, Grandpa. He gave me a strange look and just walked into the house. I thought that was the end of the story, but that would be too easy for Grandpa. He woke me up the next morning, about 3 hours before I wanted to be up, and asked if I wanted to meet Wren. It took my fuzzy brain a few minutes to realize what he was talking about before I remembered the story, and asked if he meant the tree. Yes, would you like to meet him? I sighed. I didn't have anything going on that day, so I agreed. We walked into the woods, Grandpa ambling along, and hiked for about an hour into the crisp morning air. For a man in his 70s, Grandpa moved with an odd grace through the familiar woods of his childhood. I suppose he always had, but it was more pronounced now that he was so old. The squirrels and birds were just starting to get noisy, and I could hear the sounds of the forest as we walked. The wind in the trees, the soft noises of small animals in the brush as they avoided the louder sounds of people, the sigh of the leaves as they pushed and pulled towards their inevitable death. Having come here often with my grandparents, I too had become aware of the sounds and tempers of the Appalachian forest. My cousins and I had often found it beautiful and mysterious, but it could be fickle and temperamental too. Just ask my cousin Jeremy, who had twisted his ankle in a hole, only to find that hole was the home of a rattlesnake. If you could ask him, since he'd died while we were getting help. Grandpa led us to a clearing, a small stream bubbling beside it with fresh snow run, and I could see a large, golden-barked tree growing not far from the river. It was towering, probably 15 feet tall, and as I approached, Grandpa shot a hand out and pointed down. I had nearly stepped into a small stream of honey-colored sap that was trickling away from the tree and making its way towards the river. "Don't want 2 calabashes growing so close together," Grandpa chuckled. He greeted the tree as we approached and came around to its front to touch its trunk. The tree didn't move, didn't speak, but as I came up, I could see a swirl pattern on the front that looked like 2 huge eyes. The eyes seemed to follow you whenever you moved, which was a little unsettling. Though unsettling, the tree looked no different from any other, except for the color and the weird sap. It wasn't until the wind picked up through the branches, shaking the leaves and making them dance, that I thought I heard a creaky old voice say, "Hello, Howard," in response to my grandfather's greeting. We spent some time there, just talking that day. It seems I have a lot to learn from Grandpa's old stories. Maybe I'll tell you some more sometime, if Grandpa's feeling talkative. Grandpa and I were out on the back porch, spending our evenings as we often did, when I asked him about a weird story my parents had used to scare me as a kid. It was some kind of monster cat that would eat me if I was bad, I said, swirling my beer around thoughtfully as I tried to remember what it was called. I used to live in fear of this thing, since Mom said it would come get me if I didn't do my chores. It was, the whooping cat, the whomping cat, the wampus cat, my grandpa said, draining his beer and launching it into the tree line like he often did. Yeah, that was the one. I hadn't thought about him until last night in a long time. I dreamed that I was small again, wandering around your house and looking for people. I never really saw him, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see this big shadowy creature stalking me. He kind of reminded me of one of those guys in a mascot costume. I never really got a good look at him. It was always hiding, but I remember being pretty scared as it followed me around the house. He made this kind of sound like a house cat, but loud and long, like a cat that's been startled or is about to fight. Suddenly, Grandpa loosed a cry like a scalded cat, and I heard all the animal noises around us taper off. He looked back at me and asked, "Did it sound like that?" I was speechless. Yeah, exactly like that. But how? I taught your mother how to recognize that call. I didn't want her to go through the same horrific experience I had. I was slightly confused. Experience like what exactly? The Wampus Cat. I stared at him for a moment, the night bird starting to tune up again, as Grandpa leaned back and stared at the night sky. We were silent for a few minutes, the crickets loud as they put on their last concert before autumn put them to ground. Then, Grandpa suddenly said, "I saw him once, you know." My head was a little foggy and I just mumbled out, "Saw who?" "The Wampus Cat. I saw him once." My skepticism started to claw its way out again, but ever since the tree incident, I had been a little more open to Grandpa's stories. "Yeah? You want to tell me about it?" Grandpa seemed to think about it for a minute before he began. "I was about 5 or 6 when your cousin Luke came to stay for a week. My mother's sister was going to stay with Luke's sister, her first daughter, to help her deliver her baby, and she asked if Luke could stay for a while. Mama said that he'd be staying in my room with me, and even though I said I didn't mind, I wasn't very excited by the prospect of Luke staying with us. Luke was not a good kid, you see. Luke was the baby in his family, 2 older brothers and a sister who were all out of the house, and this had led to him being a bit of a brat. He was also a bully, and I knew I would have to keep an eye on my things if I didn't want them to go missing, that was. I would also have to make sure to spend as much time in the woods as I could when I wasn't in school. Otherwise, Luke would likely make up excuses to play rough with me. I wasn't a fragile child, but Luke was a few years older than me, and I had often seen bruises after we played. So Luke came over, bag packed for a week or more, and Aunt Kara thanked us for letting him stay. Despite her difficult son, Aunt Kara was an absolute delight, and I didn't hold it against her that I would have to deal with Luke for the foreseeable future. She gave me a tight hug, thanking me for taking Luke into my room and promising me something special when she came back. I thanked her, but I was thinking that the only gift I was looking forward to was the return of my room and my quiet existence. I showed Luke to our room, showing him the cot he would be sleeping on. I turned to find him putting his bag at the foot of my bed. When I asked him what he was doing, he just grinned like a fox and waggled his finger at me. "Not very Christian of you to make a guest sleep on that saggy old cot. A real guest would have been offered the bed while you sleep on the cot, don't you think?" I wanted to argue with him, but I realized it wouldn't do any good. As I tried to get comfortable on that cot that night, listening to Luke snore lustily in my bed, I knew it was going to be a long few weeks. After a week of having Luke there, though, I was good and ready for him to be gone. In that time, he had managed to sprain my wrist after he pushed me out of a tree, stole my favorite rock from my collection, though he claimed he hadn't done it, and break any number of the small number of toys I owned. To my parents, he was an angel, always minding his manners around my mother and especially around my strict father. He always appeared to help with chores, walked with me to school, and was polite while they were around. The second their backs were turned, though, he cut school and shirked his chores and mocked their bumpkin ways to their backs. Then, one Sunday, it all came to a head. It was working towards mid-afternoon. the sun taking on that golden tint that you see when it's getting ready to set, when a knock came at the door, hard and frantic. Daddy went to get it, and it turned out to be Mrs. Douglas, our second closest neighbor. She had ran nearly 6 miles to our house to get our help. You see, she needed to get Mr. Douglas to the hospital. He had fallen off a ladder while fixing something and broke his leg pretty badly. She had managed to get him onto the porch, but she couldn't drive him there herself since they didn't own a car. This was the mid-1930s, so that wasn't uncommon, and my parents agreed to help her. Mama told us to stay here while she went to help Daddy, telling us to tidy up while she was gone. I asked Mama if I could go with them, saying I wanted to help, but really just not wanting to be left alone with Luke. Mama smiled and ruffled my hair, thinking I was just trying to avoid my chores, and told me that I had to stay here and watch over the house while they were gone. Besides, you don't want the Wampus cat to hear you're shirking your responsibilities, do you? That had sent a chill up my spine. Much like you, I was pretty scared of that Wampus cat. Not just because my mama talked about it, but because my grandmama talked about it. Grandma used to say that the Wampus cat came to get little kids who disobeyed their parents, dragging them off into the woods to devour them in its lair. She said he roamed the woods, listening for misbehaving children, and took care of them so their parents no longer had to be burdened with them. He has coal black fur and glowing embers for eyes. He's as tall as a man and as wide as a bear. He has razor-sharp teeth that seem too big for his mouth and claws like kitchen knives. You'll know him by his cry, a sound like a cat scalded by the stove and by the smell of fresh blood. Nothing will stop him from getting his prey. Nothing. And you don't want to be the focus of his ire. When Grandma told me to beware of something, I bewared it. So, as the old truck rumbled out of the front yard, I set about my chores. There were dishes to be washed, there were floors to sweep, and there were counters to clean, and there was washing to bring in as well. As I started wiping the counter, I heard Luke snort, continuing to throw the baseball he had been playing with into the air before catching it. He hadn't gotten up from the couch, and he was sitting with his head near the ground and his feet on the back, something Mama had asked him not to do. You don't still believe in that old cat, do you? I looked up, confused by the question. Of course, Mama wouldn't lie about something like that. Don't you? No. I figured out a while ago that the Wampus cat was made up. Have you ever seen a cat that big? It's all just nonsense. I tried to rationalize this, the cleaning cloth still held in my hand. That couldn't be right. My mama would never lie to me, and my grandma would certainly never lie to me. My mama might tease me sometimes, but she always told me it was a joke afterward. My grandma, though, did not joke about the strange things that might be found in the Appalachians. This would muddy the water and might cause me to question something that might very well get me killed. As Luke played with his ball, I continued to clean and finish my chores. As I cleaned, I began to feel something watching me. It began as a tickle on the back of my neck, that feeling that I wasn't quite alone. As I washed the dishes, I could almost feel a presence looming just out of sight, its hulking form seen out of the corner of my eye. It seemed to linger near the windows, its bulk sometimes blocking out the light. I felt my eyes creeping over to have a look, but I remembered what my grandma had always said and kept my eyes forward and away from the windows. If you ever feel something watching you, it's best to just ignore it. Some critters really don't like being seen, and seeing them could be the last thing you ever do. I finished the dishes as the sun began to sink towards the edge of the horizon. I could feel those eyes behind me, could feel them boring into me.
and I didn't want to look at whatever possessed those eyes. It seemed intent on me, showing no attention to my cousin in the living room. I had to finish cleaning. Mama would be mad if I didn't. I turned around, my legs like wooden pegs beneath me, and felt my stomach sink into my throat as I saw him. I only saw him for a second, but that was a second too long. He loomed in the window near the mudroom, his bulk making the setting sun appear muted. His fur was coal black, looking matted and tangled as the burdock stood out against the glass. His eyes were living coals, seeming to simmer in his head as he stared at me. His claws tapped lightly against the window, those long yellow talons that sprouted from his furry hands. His teeth were too big for his mouth, and they poked out haphazardly from a heaving maw that fogged the glass with every breath. He moved away after a few seconds, pushing his bulk out of the window sill, but it had been long enough to etch his image in my memory. I felt the hardwood of the cabinet as it ground against my back. I sat down hard on my backside, my eyes glued to the window as they bulged in fear. The window was empty now, but I could still see the remains of his final, gasping breath. I could still see his face if I closed my eyes, and those claws would haunt my dreams for many nights to come. I was shaking as I watched the window, seeing his shadow as it slid across the porch, his weight making the boards groan and the slats creak. "What are you doing?" I looked over, seeing Luke standing there with a questioning look spread across his face. I pointed shakily towards the door, my voice refusing to come out. "Oh, what? Is it the great Wampus cat waiting for me?" I nodded furiously, pointing at the window. Luke moved to the window, looking out onto the porch and snorting at me. He said he didn't see anything out there, and moved to the door to open it. I cried out, not making any intelligible sound, not wanting him to let it in. I sounded like a dog strangling on a bit of something, unable to draw in breath. He unlocked the door and turned the handle, pulling the door as if in slow motion. I screamed internally as that door swung open, my throat holding it in till I felt like I might burst. He stepped out onto the porch, looking around the door before turning back to grin at me. "Well, either he's great at hiding or he ain't here. Almost like he's made up. I told you there was no Wampus cat, nothing to punish naughty kids. Your mama lied, just like mine, and there's nothing that can do anything about—" A shadow fell across him. My attention had been drawn away as he spoke, but it snapped back to the large black silhouette behind him as the doorway was engulfed. Luke still stood grinning in victory, but his smile dribbled off his face as he took notice of the shadow that fell across the floor. He turned his head ever so slightly, but I don't think he ever saw the Wampus cat. The creature wrapped its thick furry arms around him, lifting him easily into that gaping maw of razor-sharp piano keys. Luke screamed as his head slid into that toothy mouth, and he went on screaming until the Wampus cat crunched down and ended his life. He stared at me as he stood there, Luke's body hanging in his arms, before he turned and took his grisly supper back into the sea of green.
I sat there, speechless, as my grandpa finished his story. The night sounds were all around us again, the birds and the bugs tuning up, as Grandpa took a sip from his nearly forgotten beer. His throat had been getting rough towards the end, and the beer seemed to wet it like a dry valley in a rainstorm. He finished the beer in one pull and launched the bottle into the woods, where it shattered against a tree. "So, what happened when they got home? Surely they didn't believe that a big
cat monster came and ate your cousin." He stared into the dark, his face that of a child who's been scared into silence. He was quiet for so long that I thought he had fallen asleep, and I snapped my fingers in front of his face a few times to see if he was dozing. He snapped awake after a few seconds of this, blinking and looking around as the fear slid away. Even so, it was several minutes before he spoke.
"Well, as it usually happened, Grandma came to save me. Not from the Wampus cat, of course. He only took naughty children. She came to save me from my terror. She came and found me shaking like a leaf, the door still open, and the sun sinking low in the sky. She took me to her house and wrapped me in a quilt. I sat there for hours, my mind throbbing under the weight of all that fear. It isn't every day you see the focus of your fears made flesh, and I spent a few days at my grandma's house as my mind tried to make sense of all of it. My mother came in a panic after finding Luke and me missing, and when Grandma told her what had happened, she tried to push her way to me immediately. Grandma held her back, though, telling her to be patient with me. He's been through a lot, Possum. Give him time and let him rest. He's seen the Wampus cat and lived to tell the tale. Not many can say that. I sat in that shaking stupor for quite some time before I was able to gain control of myself again. Aunt Kara came to see Grandma too, and I heard her crying. She cried, she wailed as I shivered beneath my blanket, but she never told anyone what had happened to her son. I heard she told everyone that he drowned in a lake while swimming, and no one asked any questions because that's just the way things were out here sometimes. I never saw her again. She seemed to have lost her taste for the Appalachians. I went back home, and I learned to live with the knowledge that there were things out there that could kill me, things that played by their own rules. This was my first taste of strangeness, and I never forgot it.
Somewhere in the woods, a cat yowled, and I shuddered to my core. I knew it was nothing but a mountain bobcat, but it was still a little too close to the cry my mother had always made for my taste. I got up then, taking my own bottle to the garbage as I went back inside. Grandpa asked me where I was going before I could walk in, and it took me a few seconds before I could answer him. I forgot to take out the garbage earlier. I don't want any damn cat to think I'm shirking my house chores. My grandpa's laughter followed me into the house. It's Christmas time in the Appalachians, and the holidays are as big a deal here as they are anywhere. That being said, Grandpa's been keeping me pretty busy lately. On December 1st, as I lay sleeping off the leftovers of Thanksgiving turkey, which we'd been eating all week, Grandpa shook me awake and said it was time we got started. I tried to roll over, tried to tell him to let me sleep a bit longer. He just shook me again and told me to get up and help him get the things from the attic. When I asked what things we were getting, he looked shocked.
"Why, Christmas decorations. We have to make sure everything's ready for the season."
Grandpa has always been a nut for Christmas time. I can remember visiting my grandparents during the holidays, smelling the aromas of the season as I walked through the door. Gingerbread, sugar cookies, Grandma's traditional fruitcake, which she usually gave as gifts and tasted better than anything from the store, and the cinnamon miasma of homemade cider. Grandma baked from November 22nd to January 5th, and our house always seemed to contain a pie or a cookie or some other confection she had whipped up for the season. And while Grandma baked, Grandpa decorated. As we set it all up, I realized the Herculean effort Grandpa must have gone into every year to make the house look as festive as possible. Garland was stretched on every eve, mistletoe hung in bushels, lights twinkled merrily, and the sounds of Christmas decorations, as well as the wooden decorations that Grandpa carved, were everywhere. Some of you have asked on that note what Grandpa does with himself to keep busy, and I'm here to tell you that he's one of the best woodworkers in the valley. He makes furniture, walking sticks, many other pieces that he usually sells at the flea market, usually around this time of year, actually. Even the most jaded child's eyes would often light up at the sight of a deer or a wolf that Grandpa had cozied out of a block of pine or spruce or maple, and many of the intricate decor pieces looked very homey against the singing horde of Walmart abominations. After a week of setting up plastic deer, hanging Christmas lights, and nailing garland around the house, I felt tired and a little Scroogey. I had already figured in my head that, come the 1st of January, I was going to have to take all this crap down and help him stow it again. Grandpa had thrown up half a Walmart holiday section and a quarter of the local hardware store's holly jolly aisle. I just knew that it would take a week to get this all back in the attic, and the thought was making me testy already. I was hanging stockings from the fireplace when I heard a sudden chirp of a cricket. I jumped a little, not expecting to hear the sudden invasion of the insect. I hadn't heard a cricket since the cold front a few weeks ago. He was a big fella, too. His body was coal black, and his legs were long and sinuous. He sounded off again, hopping a little closer to the crackling fire, and I reached slowly for the magazine sitting on the end table. This guy had clearly been hiding amongst the decorations, and I didn't want to have to deal with him until spring. When my hand met resistance, I looked back to see that Grandpa had caught the end of my magazine.
"Don't do it, boy. It could be the worst mistake of your life."
I gave him a strange look, but relaxed my arm nonetheless. "Sounds like maybe you have some experience with this sort of thing," I said, moving over to help Grandpa with the tree as he prepared to spin another of his yarns. Grandpa put a hand down for the cricket, and it seemed to come to him as though it knew him.
"It was the worst month of my life, that's for sure," he began, putting the cricket on his shoulder as he began his story with his usual flair. "'Twas the night after Thanksgiving, and all through our home, no one was sleeping. A cricket did roam. The cricket had been waking us up every night for 2 weeks. No one knew where he'd come from. Snow would come early to the mountain that year, and there was never a time when there wasn't at least a few inches on the ground after Halloween. A blizzard was coming, and the old-timers were predicting feet of snow for Christmas. 2 of my cousins, John and Matthew, were staying with us for the foreseeable future. Their parents were up north and snowbound by a sudden blizzard. They had sent a letter with some money and asked us to look after them until they could get back. We were happy to oblige. Unlike Luke, they were good company. All of us were around the same age, 10 or close enough, and we spent our days in the yard building snowmen, having snowball fights, and sledding. It could have been one of the best Christmases of my life, were it not for the cricket and what it brought with it. The cricket was still alive for 2 very good reasons. The first was that, as everyone in the Appalachians knows, a cricket on your hearth, especially at Christmas time, is good luck. My grandma said so, and my mother and father, not typically superstitious, also said so. Despite its chirping keeping us awake, my parents refused to kill it. They always held firm to the idea that the cricket would bring good luck, but I suspect there was another side of that coin that they weren't telling us. The other reason was just as simple. We couldn't find him. We suspected that he was in the chimney, but he didn't seem too bothered by the heat from our fireplace. My parents assumed he was in a crevice in the stonework, and that's why his chirping was so loud. His chirping would come vibrating down the chimney stack and quaver across the house so all could suffer his noise. Then, one day, I suppose I had finally had enough. It was late, the middle of the night, and the cricket had been sounding off every hour. A single loud chirp that would scrape across my consciousness like a razor and bring me shuddering awake. After 7 or 8 days of this, I was getting rattled, and the lack of real sleep was starting to make us all a little cranky. No matter how many pillows you put over your head,
or how hard you stuffed the cotton in your ears, or whatever you decided to do to block out the noise, the sound would shiver into your eardrums and bring you awake with jarring clarity. I had gotten up to get a drink of water when I finally saw the little bastard. I was walking to the kitchen when I heard him chirp. I turned to look at the crackling fire, and I saw his tiny form dancing in the backdrop. He was just sitting there, warming himself and chirping happily. I reached towards the counter as my hand closed around the fly swatter, knowing I was about to end his reign of terror. I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering that I shouldn't do it, but my sleep-deprived mind only wanted one thing. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. And above all else, I wanted to sleep. The cricket looked up at me as though to ask if it could help me. His body crunched as I brought the swatter down on him, and for a moment, I basked in the sudden quiet as I headed back to bed. But that silence wouldn't last long. No sooner had I climbed back into bed, snuggling down and getting ready to sleep, than I heard it again, the merry chirp of a cricket. My eyes popped open. I looked around my room for the source of the noise. The room was empty, filled with the shadows cast by the moon as it played amongst my toys and clothes and other objects hanging around. The chirp had sounded close, though, like it was in the room with me. It had been annoying before, but now it was so loud I could barely stand it. I was getting ready to hunker down, thinking I was imagining things, when a small black shape jumped closer to the bed. It was framed in the moonlight, its antenna wiggling intently, and its shape was impossible to mistake. I covered my head with my pillow, burrowing under the quilts and blankets I had piled on my bed to keep warm. They did little to stop my shivering as I lay hunkered beneath them, unsure of what to do next. Was it following me? Was it a ghost? I had left the cricket as a smear on the stone in the living room. I didn't know what to make of this new cricket, but its presence definitely spooked me. When it sounded off beneath the covers, I jumped, scuttling backwards as I tried to get some distance between it and me. I could feel something on my face, its pinchy feet scuttling over my lips and cheek, and I slapped my hand to my face trying to swipe it away. It seemed to be one step ahead of my searching hands, though, and when I felt the legs touch my ear, I slapped at the side of my head hard enough to make my ears ring. Despite my ringing ears, though, I still felt the cricket slide into my head, and my horror made me shudder in silence. I felt the tears leak down my face as the sharp tweet of the cricket came from right inside my ear, sounding huge and deafening. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I was too busy hearing the cricket as he chirped inside my noggin. I woke up groggy and scared, unsure if I had been dreaming or if any of it had actually happened. I stuck my finger in my ear and rooted, not feeling anything. The chirping was gone, and by the light of day, I could believe that it was all just a dream. I could hear people talking quietly in the living room, and I rolled out of bed, ready to start another day of fun. My cousins were up already when I staggered into the living room. They were sipping mugs of heavily doctored coffee and looking at the snow as it came down. As I stood watching the fresh powder fall, I winced when a sudden loud chirp blistered my eardrums. I was on the verge of hyperventilating, having come to terms with the fact that it had indeed been real. My eyes felt like they might bug out of my head, and I staggered back a step as I clutched my ear. "What's wrong with you?" John asked, looking at me strangely. Cricket, I gasped, putting a finger in my ear and shaking it. I felt nothing. Nothing came out, but I knew what I had heard. "I know, isn't it great?" Matthew said. "First good night's sleep I've had all week. I didn't hear that little bugger all night. Me either, John agreed, and they clinked their mugs together in celebration. I was glad they had slept well, but it appeared my troubles were just beginning. The snow came down, piling high enough to cover Daddy's truck, and Mama was afraid that we would be snowbound soon. We had a lot of supplies laid in, but with 5 of us living here 24 hours a day, the supplies were likely to only last a few weeks. We were just kids, though, and while my parents worried about supplies, we played in the snow. I had hoped that the cold might deter the cricket, maybe even draw him out, but I never felt him stir all day. What I did feel was his ear-piercing chirps at random times throughout the day. When I came inside later, I had developed a slight twitch from the sudden and unpredictable chirping of the cricket. As the days persisted, my mother became concerned at the jumpy, twitchy way I was starting to act. The chirps were like an ice pick in my head, and I knew that I wouldn't sleep a wink that night for the noise. As I lay awake, hearing the pair of crickets chirping at odd intervals in my skull, I remember the crickets chirp from the living room as a happy memory. The week that followed was a bit of a blur. I lived in a state of constant pain. I don't think I slept more than a few minutes a night. Sometimes the thing would chirp ceaselessly, making my head ring like the inside of a bell. Sometimes he would lure me into a false sense of security, though, by not chirping for hours, only to chirp loudly just as I would drift off to sleep. Sometimes it would sound like one cricket. Sometimes it would sound like a whole swarm of crickets had hopped in and started chirping around inside my head. By the end of that week, I was ready for the funny farm, and I worried that my life would never be the same again. Luckily for me, Grandma came through again. After 7 straight days, the snow was halfway up the window. It had been falling steadily, and a real blizzard was brewing outside. We had all been kept inside as Daddy tried to keep the front door clear, and my cousins were reading or playing with toys as I slowly went mad. I was sitting in the corner, the twitching becoming worse by the day, and everyone had started avoiding me. I was deteriorating mentally since the cricket had gotten into my ear, becoming a prisoner in my own body. I shook. I made strange noises. I pissed my pants sometimes. I seemed to cry ceaselessly. I had seen a kid at school once that had fits, and he had sat in the back and twitched just this way. I remembered being scared that I would be like this forever, and I remembered praying to God to help get this cricket out of my head. As if in response, the door burst open, and my grandma came in with a bundle of firewood under each arm. Grandma had come from her house to ours, and no one was quite sure how she had carried 2 large stacks of firewood through the snow like that. Mama had my cousins take the firewood and set Grandma down by the fire. She didn't immediately see me, but her eyes grew wide and concerned when she did. She didn't say anything then, but she came to my room after my parents and cousins went to bed that night to talk to me. "What have you done, my love?" she asked as I lay in bed. I turned my weeping eyes to hers and stuttered out the whole story. I told her about the cricket, the constant chirping, the erosion of my mental state, and she just nodded. I explained it through the chirping explosions of my head's house guest, and she seemed ready to weep with me every time I twitched. She took it all in, and when I was done, she got up and said she needed some things from her house. "It may take me some time to get the things I need, but I think I can remove this curse from you. Stay strong, love. I'll be back as quickly as I can." For the next 3 days, I neither ate nor slept. Mama fussed over me,
trying to get me to eat something. Daddy thought I had just gone stir crazy and told her just to wait and see if I would snap out of it. My cousins were curious, but ultimately grew tired of watching me lie in bed and drool on my quilt. Inside my head, the crickets were the only ones who kept me company. Their chirping grew more erratic as time went on. Mama changed my clothes when I messed myself, but eventually she just left me naked with a towel under me. I don't remember those days very well. I mostly just existed. Mama was getting worried about Grandma, too. She just left out into the snow without a word. What happens if she freezes out there? Don't you worry, Pook, my daddy said to her. Mama's been living in these mountains for a long time. She knows how to come and go without much fuss. I hoped, in as much capacity as I could hope, that he was right. Grandma couldn't get lost in the mountains. Could she? I had seen her navigate these hills with ease in any season. The thought that she could get herself lost was laughable at best, but the thought that a cricket could infest my mind had seemed silly too a few weeks ago. Then, sometime in the wee hours of the fourth day, I looked up, and she was there. She picked me up as easy as a rag doll and took me through the dark house. The boards creaked sleepily, and the snow pattered gently on the window. I could hear the sounds of my family as they snored around us, and if they heard us, they never stirred. She took me into the bathroom and locked the door, sitting me into the heavy tub that had been Daddy's wedding present to Mama all those years ago. She poured in water, cold and fresh, as she opened her bag. She also had several buckets of lukewarm water, and I felt my skin break out in goose prickles as I lay there in the semi-warmth. Hold still now, and don't interrupt, she said, pouring a packet of dried something on me. She sprinkled me with dust, with herbs, with salves, and even something that stung my eyes and made my skin tingle. She chanted as she did it, and I could see the flicker of flames as she spoke in her grandmother's tongue, as she called it. She spoke something long and musical, something deep and winding, and as I felt a wiggle in my ear, I sucked in a ragged breath. It felt like someone was pulling steel wool out of my head, and I gritted my teeth as I waited for it to be over. Suddenly, I heard a loud plop as it fell into the tub. I turned my head to look, but Grandma hissed at me to be still. She likely knew what was coming next, but I was unprepared for the sudden torrent. My ears began to buzz, and my head felt like it might burst. I could hear the ringing of 1,000 different crickets, and I felt them pouring out and filling the tub. Their feet and antennae scraped at my ears. Their shrill cries made me want to scream, and as they fell into the water, I heard them tweet in pain as they drowned. My grandmother lifted me out suddenly, holding me close as the sounds of the dying insects grew louder and louder. When it finally stopped, we cried together, my ears mercifully quiet. I looked at him, the firelight twinkling in his eyes as he came back from that long ago Christmas time. So, your grandmother cured you? I asked. Well, sort of. I've had a persistent ringing in my ear ever since, but the chirping was indeed gone. A few days later, and I was back to my old self, though I could still swear I heard the phantom cricket sounds for about a week after she took the curse off me. My eyes went a little wide then. The cricket cursed you? Grandpa nodded. It was all my grandmother could figure. The little critter had been killed needlessly, and instead of good luck, it had bestowed a curse instead. Grandma said I had been lucky she had come around. The cricket in my head would have eventually become too much, and I would have probably died
or gone too crazy to ever come back from it.
I looked back to the cricket, now showing a bit more respect. What will you do with that fella? Grandpa told me to follow him, and he took me back into his room. In his bathroom, the whole thing wrapped with a towel to keep the cold out, was a small mesh cage that contained about 5 or 6 sluggish crickets. They nibbled on potato slices, drank water from a dish, and hopped around the wood chips on the floor of the cage. Grandpa added his new friend to the cage and smiled at me as he closed the little door.
I'll take them to the woods when it gets warm, the ones that last the winter anyway. I always release them come spring, so they can bring luck to others next winter.
I hugged him then, glad he had saved me from something similar to the fate that he had endured, and he patted my back happily.
Now, come on, he said a few minutes later, listening to the crickets tooting up in their cage. We have to make this place ready for Santa Claus. I met him once. Did I ever tell you about that?
And as we went back to our decorating, he told me about a night in Alaska where he had indeed met the jolly old man himself. Grandpa and I were spending another night on the porch, having a beer and listening to the sounds of an early spring. The snow had melted and the critters were just starting to wake up. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and small animals as they moved about in the light snow that still seemed to hang around sometimes. I had seen a possum the other day, heard him digging through the trash too, so I knew that the snow wouldn't last much longer. As we sat, Grandpa telling me a story about the time a bear cub had crawled into the cab of his truck, I saw another hopeful sign. In the woods, about 10 feet from the house, were fireflies. They were hovering in the air, winking on and off, and Grandpa's story suddenly fell into the background as I sat, unable to take my eyes off them. They were beautiful, the first fireflies of the season, and as Grandpa rolled over me like white noise, I felt myself getting up and going to see them. They weren't too far away. I could get to them in a few seconds, and I got a little mad when Grandpa grabbed my arm, but the second I looked into his eyes, taking them off the lights, I forgot why.
Don't follow them lights, son. Bad things happen if you follow the fairy lights.
Fairy lights? I asked, sitting down, feeling a little woozy.
Yeah, devious little buggers. They're not actually fairies, though. Even they don't really know what they are, but they fear them and avoid them when they can.
Wait, I said, my head a little floaty. Like real fairies?
One story at a time, kiddo. We're talking about the fairy lights. They almost got me once. Did I ever tell you about that?
He threw his bottle into the woods, and to my surprise, the fairy lights stopped blinking. No, but it sounds like you're about to.
Grandpa smiled. Seems that way. This story begins as most bad decisions often do, with drinking. I was about 16 when I had encountered the fairy lights. It wasn't the first time I'd seen them, but it was the first time they had really affected me. I first saw them when I was about 2 or 3, sitting on my grandma's porch. I got up and tried to toddle after them, wanting to catch them and see what they were. When my grandma scooped me up, boy, was I mad. She said I swung my chubby fist at her until there was a door between us and the lights, and then I was just as mild as paint. She told me a few years later, when I was older, that the lights were bad and that I must never follow them. They lead people into the woods, and most of the people are never seen again. No one knows what they are, but they seem to delight in getting people lost. I always went inside when I saw them after that, not wanting the temptation. Grandma told me, too, that they usually took children, so I was especially wary of them. Grandma had always been honest with me about the things that would hurt me in the forest, and when she told me to beware, I bewared. She helped me a lot, she taught me a lot, and I owe her my life more times over than I can count. This time, though, she wasn't around to save me. They say that luck belongs to children and drunks, and a good thing for me that it does. It was Saturday night, and my friends Dale and Fred and Clarence and I had pulled back into the woods in Dale's old farm truck. We'd been working all day at the mill, chopping trees to load onto trailers, and we were sticky and tired. Dale had hooked a jug of his dad's shine. His dad was a prolific moonshiner in those days, and we were drinking and talking and just relaxing after a long day. There was talk that America might go into the war, World War II that was, and we were all scared that we might get drafted. We were just backwoods hicks. We didn't know nothing about foreign places or distant theaters of combat, but we knew that men died in war and that men came back crippled and changed. The drunker we got, though, the less we started caring about the war and the more we started loosening up. Dale was in the back of the truck, pretending to be our teacher, Mr. Popper, when we saw the lights. Dale had a knack for imitations, and Mr. Popper was an Englishman with a very thick accent. Dale had been strutting about, speaking to us in that way that Mr. Popper had. Mr. Popper always sounded like someone in a Shakespeare play, and went way over the heads of some of us Appalachian stump thumpers. We had all been laughing and cawing at the way he captured the man so well, and he had just raised his finger to deliver one of those plummy British idioms that Mr. Popper was so fond of, when he stopped and looked out into the woods. He had been silent for about 5 seconds, just staring drunkenly out into the forest, when he finally whispered, "What is that?" We all turned around to see what he was seeing, and that's when we saw the lights too. Growing up in the middle of nowhere, I had never seen a radio tower before. These lights were like the blinking lights on top of those towers. They were foggy and hard to discern, and they would wink on and off as they seemed to float. The longer we watched in our drunken haze, the more enticing those lights began to look. Dale and I had climbed slowly out of the back of the truck and began to walk towards them, and Fred and Clarence were moving like deep-sea divers as they followed. Even drunk out of our mind like I was, I seemed to remember that there was something I should remember about those lights. The more I tried to think about it, though, the more important it seemed. I just couldn't come up with it, though. I decided to follow them into the woods. Maybe then I'd remember. And so, all 4 of us found ourselves tripping through the pitch-black woods by night, stumbling and laughing as we followed those lights. The farther into the woods we went, the more the idea that we shouldn't be here nagged at me. I had a bottle in my hand that I seemed unable to let go of. It was a RC Cola or something, and the other 3 were staggering after those lights, all of us laughing like fools. I remember Clarence tripping over a log and cutting his forehead pretty bad, but he just got up and grinned and laughed as he followed those lights. The lights seemed to be making us drunker, if that makes any sense. We kept stumbling after them, deeper and deeper as they got farther and farther away. I say they got farther, but it was like they never moved. Them lights kept blinking and twinkling in different colors, and they always seemed to be farther away than we remembered them. We kept stumbling after them, and they just kept getting farther away, and in our drunken stupor, we never questioned it. We all just laughed and chuckled, saying how we would catch 'em and find out what was making those lights. I don't know if they ever figured it out, but I still haven't to this day. The deeper into the woods we got, the more it seemed like it was getting foggy. The ground was really hard to find, and as we tripped along, we started to feel like we were in a cloud. I'm sorry if that doesn't make much sense, but you have to remember I was 16 and drunk and under the influence of whatever those lights were. I can only remember this in that muzzy way you remember dreams. I can see the lights, I can see the fog, and the trees around me are just vague outlines in my mind as it goes in slow motion and then in double time. I couldn't tell you how long we wandered through those woods, but I know where that wandering came to an end. We had come to a point where the lights had started to get closer. There were about 7 of them, each of them a different color. I wouldn't be able to have said it at the time, because we really didn't have such things,
but they were like the lights on a Christmas tree, only bigger. Oranges and reds and purples and blues and greens, whites, even a black one that shouldn't have been able to be seen, but it was. The fog was thick around our feet, and I couldn't have told you what part of the woods we were in. We could have been halfway to Elijah for all I know, but it hardly mattered, as the lights seemed to be letting us get closer at long last. We came through a stand of trees, and there they were, just floating 15 feet away from us. Each of them was about 4.5 feet tall and seemed to wink in and out of existence as we watched them. I can hear their voices telling us to come on, to come see them, and I saw Dale stumble forward, his hand outstretched to do just that. Then he fell forward, and I never saw him again. It didn't really bother me that Dale had disappeared. In fact, at the time, it seemed funny. I remember Clarence almost doubling over in laughter, thinking that Dale was pulling a trick or something. Clarence and Fred went forward next, hands outstretched like they meant to touch him, and they laughed and slurred their words as they went. They were laughing and joking, saying how they wondered if the lights would be cold or hot. Then they disappeared, and it was just me. I would have gone with Clarence and Fred, but the need to make water had overtaken me. In my drunken state, I hadn't even been able to get my pants down, and as I wet myself, the lights just kept talking to me. They wanted me to come to them. They wanted me to touch them. They wanted me to see what they had for me. I wasn't afraid. Far from it. I wanted to go. I wanted to see them, and I wanted to see where my friends had gone. I knew that the light had made them disappear, and I really wanted to see where they had gone to. If that rock hadn't been in my way, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Mostly 'cause I'd be dead, and you would have never been born. The rock seemed to grab my foot, and I went down hard on my face. As I fell, the bottle I had been holding smashed, and I felt my hand get wet and painful as the glass sank into it. The voice in my head changed then, and I heard the worst screaming of my life. It was like the pits of hell had opened up, and I could hear all the tortured souls within. I looked up, and I could see the lights pulsating real fast, hurting my eyes, hurting my brain, putting my face down in the dirt. I waited for all that screaming to be over. When I came to, it was morning time, and my hand was on fire. The alcohol had worn off, and I was looking around. I could see the lights and the mist from the night before were gone. I was face down on the forest, my pants stiff from having dried that way, and my hand hurting something fierce. As I got up, though, these things were nothing next to the surprise that awaited me. I stood up and almost tumbled head first over the edge of a ravine. Down below, I could see the bodies of my friends. The lights hadn't taken them anywhere. It appeared the only thing that had taken them was gravity. I stumbled away from the edge of that cliff and went running into the woods. I didn't care about my hand or my pants or anything except the need to get as far away from it as possible. The state police found me 2 days later, dehydrated and starving. My parents, it seemed, had reported me missing, and after they found Dale's truck, the state police and volunteers had begun canvassing the woods. They had almost given up when they found me sleeping next to a tree. They had bundled me up, got me some food, and asked me what happened to Dale and Fred and Clarence. I told them about the lights. I told them about the ravine, but I couldn't begin to tell them where that ravine might be. I told them when I came to, I had seen the bodies of my friends down there and had started running in a panic. They thought for a moment that I might have been responsible for them falling into that ravine,
but there was nothing in my background to show that I had any tendencies like that. So they let me go, and a year later, I joined the army and went overseas. They never found the bodies of my friends, and I've been throwing bottles ever since to keep them damn lights away.
I watched him closely as he finished. I wanted him to tell me it was a joke or a goof or something. Instead, Grandpa sat looking into the woods, silent as the grave. He took the bottle out of my numb hands, not even looking at me when he did it, and threw it into the woods. It made a skeletal breaking sound as it hit the tree, which seemed to bring me out of my state. "Why do they fear the sound of breaking glass?" I asked him hesitantly.
I have no idea, son. Grandma, my grandma, might have known, but by the time I saw them, she was 3 years in her grave and too far gone for me to ask.
"Are they the ones that clean up the glass?" It was a question I'd been wondering about for quite some time, and I thought perhaps I had my answer now. Grandpa just shook his head, though.
Heavens, no, not they. That's for...
But he stopped, looking at me side-eyed with a gap-toothed grin.
But I think that's enough stories for tonight. These old bones are ready for bed.
He got up and went inside, and I followed close behind him. Suddenly, I wasn't so keen on sitting out here by myself. We were watching TV one night, Grandpa in his chair and me in Grandma's old rocker. I sighed heavily. It had been a long day. Grandpa had me mending fences most of the day, a job that required 2 trips to town, the hauling of some heavy material, and a lot of sweating in the afternoon sun. Of course, Grandpa hadn't done any of that except for the riding into town. What he had done was mostly sit on a big rock and watch me work, filling my day with stories about this, that, or the other. The fence had finally been mended just as dark began to creep in, and I was rocking contentedly as we watched something on Grandpa's TV. Grandpa watched very little TV, but when he did, it was usually only one of 3 things. He watched the news 3 times a day. He watched Hadrian Meadows at 8 and 4 for the Fish and Game Report. And he liked to watch Spook Central. Spook Central was a show about some local paranormal investigators who liked to go around and inspect local haunts in the area. They went to many historic and infamous locations, and generally stirred up the things that went bump in the night around there. It came on most nights on Channel 12, in new episodes or in reruns, and Grandpa loved it. We watched Spook Central the way most people watch sitcoms. He was always so amused at the crew's antics, and he was always chuckling at something that they were saying or doing. Tonight's episode, though, they were talking about banishing a demon from the ruins of an old church, and I heard Grandpa scoff as they talked about the means of cleansing.
"Bunch of hacks," he said, shaking his head.
I glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow at the comment. "So aside from devil cats, forest lights, and cursed insects, you're also an expert on exorcism, I guess."
"Of course," he said confidently. "I went with my grandma to several houses while she was helping people out. I watched her get rid of all kinds of haints and spirits and bedeviled people, but I only watched her fail once."
He paused for dramatic effect before adding,
"Luckily, the snake-handling man came along."
I looked at him oddly.
"The what?" "The snake-handling man. 'Smatter, boy? Didn't your daddy ever take you to see a snake handler?"
"I mean, I saw a man handling snakes at the zoo once, but it sounds like you're talking about one of the religious ones."
"Exactly, except this fellow was the real deal," Grandpa said, getting a little excited.
I muted the TV, settling in for another Grandpa story. "Sounds better than anything on TV." I turned the rocker to look at him.
Grandpa chuckled. "That's 'cause unlike that claptrap on the TV, this story is true. When I was about 11, shortly after the cricket incident, Grandma took me under her wing and decided it was time that I was given a proper education on the ways of the woods. She had me over to her house most every afternoon so I could learn herbcraft and woodcraft. She taught me about healing with poultices and salves, about repelling things that might want to get into the house with symbols and little constructed things that hold intention. She also taught me more about the creatures of the forest and the old things that lurk in the deeper parts. Grandma was a wealth of information. I wish I had been more thankful for the time that I had with her. I had studied with her for about 6 months when I arrived one afternoon to find her putting some things into a bag. I had seen her do this many times before, but the longer I watched her, the more I realized that this was different. She had gone to people's houses before to cleanse a presence or dispel a haint, but I had always watched her select her ingredients with care and decisiveness. Today, her hands shook as she selected herbs in bundles, and as one of the bottles slid from her shaking hand, I felt my blood run cold. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my grandmother afraid of something. Despite my better judgment, I'm taking you with me tonight. Not for any lacking in yourself. You're a fine boy, but this place we're going is bad. Bad? I asked, unsure what she meant. How do you mean? She gave me an extremely hard look, as though she were weighing the idea of telling me things I might not be prepared to hear. You know about haints. You've seen the lights. You've seen the darkness that can find you when you least expect it. What we're going after tonight might be worse. Sometimes there are things that can get into a house and make it bad. Bad as it can be. These things can make people bad too. But you've put these things out before, I stuttered, fear creeping into my voice. That's true, but this is different. This is the true evil, the old evil, the kind they talk about in church. I've faced it before, but this time feels different. This time, I'm not sure if I have the strength or the will to cast them out. She gathered her provisions, and I sat pondering the nature of our work that night. Then, as the afternoon sun began to dip just the tiniest bit, we sat out for our work. We arrived as the sun hit the midpoint of its set, and I immediately wished I had never left my grandmother's house. Have you ever seen a place from your car, a perfectly normal place, and just felt like it was wrong? You couldn't tell why, and you couldn't say why, but the whole place just made your skin crawl. The shadows linger a little too thickly around the porch. The darkness nestles like bugs in the eaves, and the whole place just seems like a grinning mouth inviting you to come in. You drive past, and you shudder, but you aren't sure why, and it makes the place seem so scary. This house had an aura about it, and I could see Grandma getting nervous as well. The woman who answered the door was a friend of Grandma's. I'd seen her at the house before. I thought her name might be Ella or Ellen, but she had never looked so ragged as she did now. Her gray hair was a mess, all tangled and looking worry-worn. Her face was pitted with worry lines, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Whether they were tears of relief or tears of sorrow, I wasn't sure. "Thank God, Liza. Come in, come in. I didn't know who else to..." But then she noticed me, and her face clouded over. "Are you sure you want to bring him here? He's learning the trade, Els. The boy needs to see what it's like. He has to prepare for what he might face." The woman nodded and led us into her small home. It was little more than a one-story farmhouse set back against the rocks of the mountain. The place had a musty smell that made me think the roof probably leaked in the spring when the snow melts came off the hills, and it held a darkness that reminded me of a cave. The woman led us to her kitchen. casting frightened glances at the shadowy room that lay behind a tacked-up quilt. She made us tea and talked to us about what had been happening. Grandma smiled and nodded, the smoke from the tea ringing her face, but I barely listened. My eyes were only for what lay behind that simple quilt. It wasn't a noise, but it was like a low hum that seemed to warble across my senses. I had a friend, years and years later, a drinking buddy that lived under one of those big power lines. I used to hate getting drunk over there, because I knew I wouldn't sleep a wink unless I blacked out. That hum, that soft quarreling of currents and watts, always reminded me of that sound I heard from behind that quilt. It was like tiny people discussing monumental things, like hateful men planning mischief quietly. "And so I called you," the woman said, and I found myself jerked back to the conversation, her voice jagging up on the edge of tears. "I'll do what I can, Ellie, but this sort of thing might be beyond me. I've never done battle with anything like what you're talking about, and I'm not sure that my talent will be enough to rid you of it. Have you contacted the Catholic parish over in J? This sounds like their ball of wax more than mine." "I wrote them when it started, when he came back from the quarry like this, but they never wrote me back. I've spoken to the Baptist preacher, the Pentecostal man, even the snake handler down the holler. You know the one with the revival tent that blew into town about a month ago. You're the only one who's come to help me." Grandma soaked all this in and gave a stoic nod. Then she finished her tea and asked to see Darryl. As Ellie walked us towards that quilt, I felt my stomach tighten. She slid it aside, the motion so much like a barker as he slid the cover off a freak show tent to reveal the most darkly hideous man I had ever seen at that time. Calling him fat would not have done him justice. Darryl, a man I realized later that I knew, looked like someone in the late stages of pregnancy who's preparing to birth a litter of 8 or more, maybe. He lay on the couch that sagged beneath him, and the smell of that small room, no doubt once a sitting room, was atrocious. Darryl clearly had just been letting it drop where it would, and the smell was a rank miasma. He lay on his back, his head lolling on his neck as his stomach pressed upwards like a hillock. His gorge was of writhing flesh, purple and veined, pulsating like an egg sac ready to burst. The room was shadowy, the windows covered with only the barest of light spilling through the openings into the sitting room. I didn't want to go in there, but when my grandma put a hand on my shoulder, I felt an assuredness roll through me and knew that everything would be okay. When we stepped into the room, the man let his head flop back on his neck and stared at us in that upside-down way that children often do. He began to burble wetly to himself as we approached, a soupy, marshy sound that pulsated like tar from a bubbling pit. When did he begin to... Grandma seemed to search for the words before flapping her hands at him. "Get like this," she finally said, words deserting her in the face of this mountainous man. "About a week. About 3 days before I called you. He came back from the quarry one night, like I told you, and just wasn't himself. The next 2 days he laid up. I thought he might have a flu, but then I woke up one morning and found him on the couch. He started swelling like this, and I called the doctor to check him out. After the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with him, he suggested that I make him comfy and see if he overed it or not. That night I lay in bed and watched the shadows dance on the wall. I heard him laughing and gargling in the sitting room and saw this strange light coming from under the door. That's when I hung the quilt, and the next day I came to see you." Grandma looked like she wanted to say more, but when she looked down, she realized that the rotund man was staring straight at her. When his mouth slid open, his purple tongue lolling out, his rancid breath was nearly as bad as the words that spilled out around it. "Witch! Witch! Witch!" As he gravelled out his accusation, the scant light we had began to flicker. The walls began to spin a little, the shadows dancing as the oppressive darkness became more claustrophobic. The swollen cadaver began to rock as he cackled and accused, and I pressed myself against my grandma as the night bled into the couple's humble abode. "Ellie Mae, how could you let this witch into our house? You know what it says in the good book about suffering a witch to live." "I would assume that whatever you are, you likely have some understanding about what the Bible says about demons as well," my grandmother countered. The fleshy hillock laughed, and I could swear that hands seemed to be pressing against his body from the inside as I watched. "Do you imagine that you can cast me out? Do you imagine that your grasping power is a match for mine?" Grandma reached into her pocket and pulled out a bundle of sage as if in answer. That's how it all began. Grandma lit the sage and wafted the smoke as it danced and seemed to heliograph in the darkness. The smoke took on the forms of warding, swirling towards the dark shapes that surrounded the swollen hulk on the couch. As the smoke swirled, Grandma chanted in the old words, words she had yet to teach me, and never truly would, it turned out. She seemed to become smoke herself as she swayed amongst that darkness, and as her hands reached towards me, I would place atoms into them, poultices and charms, herbs and items of power, and it was as if my hands knew the things she needed before my brain truly did. She dabbed the man with concoctions, wafted smoke and charm over him, and I saw him shudder as she worked. He did not like her work, but it still seemed to be no more than an irritation upon his skin. As time passed, I began to feel as though the sun must rise. It had been hours after all, days since Grandma began, and I could see the sweat standing out on her. She was growing tired, her energy depleting, and that only seemed to encourage this hateful specter. He cackled and snapped his teeth at her, the bones coming together like rocks in a quarry, and I found myself growing cold as I watched him rebuff her attempts to cast him away. "Foolish old woman! Your incantations are no more than the banging of bones and the screeching of apes. I was old when your kind scratched upon the dirt, and you cannot face me and win, shaman." Grandma didn't let it show, but it appeared that she had come to the same conclusion. She began to retreat, the two of us backing towards the quilted egress point, but the shadows would not allow it. They closed in around that square of light, thick and claustrophobic, and I feared to let them touch me. It appeared that dueling to a draw would not be enough for whatever resided within Darryl. It wanted to win, and it knew that it had us on the ropes. Grandma looked down at me as she came to realize this as well, and apologized as she drew me close against her. Then the door banged open like a gunshot, and I heard the hard tack of boots on the sturdy boards as someone came towards the sitting room. The darkness parted for that one, and as he surveyed the scene, he smiled in the loony, sane way that men do when they've spent too much time away from other men. The way wood folks or desert dwellers sometimes smile when tried by some child of fluorescent lights and the steady pavement, who have never known true darkness as more than a dim movie screen. He wore a long coat, his chest bare, with shabby jeans that nearly covered his run-down cowboy boots. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, less like a cowboy's and more like a farmer's or a preacher maybe, and on his belt swung a writhing sack that hissed and rattled. The hair that poked from beneath that hat was white as midday clouds, and he looked like a scarecrow filled with barbed wire. I have no doubt that he was a little crazy, but he was the sanity we needed at that moment. He came striding into the room, untying the sack from his belt, and the creature's glee seemed forced to my ears. "Ah, another shaman to try his luck. Come to me, pretender. Come to me and know what it means to stand before Legion." The man's voice was at odds with his appearance, and his voice was rich and strident as it cut through the shadows in the house. "I am no pretender, and you are no Legion. You are a sad collection of lesser demons, fit only to scare children and vex those who are used to fighting less practical creatures. No offense, my dear." Grandmother seemed to take this declaration well from her stunned position near the door. When he reached inside the bag, the hollow rattle preceded the biggest timber rattler I had ever seen. The creature cowered a little as the face of the betrayer came out to greet him. "Here is your brother, Prince of Lies, Lord of Flies. Come now before the throne and feel his judgment." He held the rattler around the head, his thumb controlling the top as his fingers opened that killing mouth. The couch shook as the mountainous man mound tried to escape him, but as the strange man began to pray, really spinning the hellfire, I saw the snake begin to glow. Its head and body were suddenly wreathed in a glowing aura, and that aura began to draw a darkness from Darrell. The murk seemed to come swimming from his open mouth, and as it entered the serpent, the preacher dropped it and watched it try to escape. Then, as swift as any snake, the snake handler brought the bottom of that big run-down boot on the snake's head and smashed it out of existence. The man-thing on the couch screamed in agony, its gelatinous body quaking like water in a pool, but the snake handler was far from done. He reached in again and drew out another snake, the black body of a moccasin coming free from the bag this time. It hissed and reared at him, but he had caught it just so, and its writhing stopped as the corona of light enveloped it. The feet of the couch squealed in protest as the demon tried to lunge away, but they had made their vessel too large, and escape seemed like a happy dream before those dripping fangs. His bag seemed limitless. The snake handler seemed to pull more varieties of serpent from that crocus sack than I had ever seen before. Some were venomous, some were plain old slitherers, but their fates were always the same. The floor was soon thick with clotted snake blood, and the man on the couch seemed to be shrieking with every otherworldly presence pulled from him. All at once, he was less of a mountain and more of a rotund boulder. Suddenly, he was merely portly, his flesh still stretched and bruised where the demons had taken up inside of him. He tried to flee once, his legs bucking under him, before the snake handler could catch his shoulders and push him against the couch. The snake he pulled from the bag was the biggest yet, a massive rattlesnake with glistening fangs, and the demon quaked before him, knowing his time had come. "You dare not! You dare not! You are nothing! I was old when your ancestors drew out of the primordial ooze. My ancestors stumbled naked from the garden, wretch, and you will return to the pits from whence you came," the snake-handling man screamed at him. The demon's screams cascaded around us as he was laboriously drawn from the man, and the snake actually turned to strike as he fell heavily to the floor. The boot came down nonetheless, and the snake handler seemed to sag as the man on the couch breathed like a long-distance runner passing the finish line. Somehow, it had escaped my notice that the shadows were receding as he worked, and we now stood in the dimly lit sitting room of Ellie and Daryl's house. Daryl wouldn't wake up for another 3 days, and when he did, he told my grandma about breaking through into an underground tunnel and falling into a pool of the coldest water he had ever felt. As he pulled himself out, shivering on the banks, he was assaulted by things he couldn't see, and he had known nothing until he came to on the couch. He didn't remember the snake handler, the demons, or anything of the like. Daryl lived until 1973, dying at the age of 93, and he always thanked God for his longevity. He should have really have thanked the snake handling man, though, because otherwise the demons would have likely just ate him up. That night, though, with his work completed, the snake handler bent down and scooped up the remains of his snakes into the croaker sack. He tipped his hat to Ellie, now hugging her husband and crying over him, and told her he was real sorry about the mess. He clomped out the door, stopping just long enough to look down at Grandma and me and pass a word with us. "You gave it your best, child of the White, but there was just too many there for one person. You did your best. Know that God sees your efforts." Then he left, never to be seen again in these parts. I had stopped rocking at some point in the story, and was now simply sitting gape-mouthed and staring at Grandpa. "Quite a tale, isn't it?" Grandpa asked, his old chair creaking a little as the two of us sat in the aftermath. "So, you know a little about the backwoods ways? Like your grandmother knew?" I started, trying to figure out what I wanted to say. "Some," he admitted. "Grandma died before she could properly finish my training, but there's a whole different story, and I'll need to prepare before I tell it to you." Could you teach me?" I asked, fully aware by now that there were things in this world, in this very forest, that I didn't understand and did not want to run afoul of. Grandpa smiled. "Son, I'd be delighted."